My controversial issue in education was teacher effectiveness, and I decided to look at teacher effectiveness as it is associated or measured by value-added models. So hence teacher effectiveness and value-added models, the debate over measuring teacher effectiveness based on student achievement using value-added models. First of all, what is teacher effectiveness? Well, it depends on who you ask. Some studies in the 80s, as noted here, say that teacher effectiveness is based on teacher actions, behaviors, or practices. Teachers doing more hands-on activities versus lecturing. Which one provides more meaningful learning? Are they applying the concepts that they've learned? Other studies show that it's more of lesson design and delivery that defines teacher effectiveness. How well prepared is a teacher, and how do they deliver or approach their instruction? Do they differentiate among their students to try to reach each one based on each student's individual learning abilities and styles? Then we have Dave Clark with his quote from his study saying, obviously the definition involves someone who can increase a student's knowledge. Of course, yes. But it goes beyond this in defining an effective teacher. Then we jump on down to that dude, Vogt, where he kind of combined a little bit of everything else that I think better defines what an effective teacher is, because it definitely goes beyond just actions, behaviors, or practices, or lesson design or delivery. It kind of combines them all, as we are more familiar with today. And he goes to say that an effective teacher is one who provides for different student abilities, assures that students were aware of expectations, incorporates different instructional strategies into the lesson, involves the student in the learning process, uses instructional objectives outlined in the curriculum guides, so we got our SOLs. They use written outlines or course outlines, so they're using their plans, they're planning. Assessing academic and social needs of students, assessing the academic and social growth of students, and they assess for the effective learning modes of students. They understand the scope and sequence of the course, and they can plan with flexibility. So that's by his definition of what an effective teacher is. And then here are the characteristics of effective teachers, as listed really in Go, Bell, and Little's research. However, they used a boatload of different studies that kind of contributed to each one of these characteristics. And they kind of just lumped them into something to better clarify it, so there's a one-stop place to kind of go to look at what other researchers were finding most often were defining effective teachers. So the first one, we have they have high expectations for their students. Teachers have high expectations. They respect their students. They let them know what they are expecting of them and what they're supposed to do. So there's this clear cut, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, so I'm not going to lower my standards just because, a kid feels sorry for himself or something like that, or because of their background. They respect the student, and they let the student know that they have respect for them and confidence in them, and they're going to push them to try to get them to their full potential. The next one, effective teachers contribute to positive academic, attitudinal, and social outcomes for students, such as regular attendance, on-time promotion to the next grade, on-time graduation, self-efficacy, and cooperative behavior. Again, kind of just going in with the high expectations that a teacher has, an effective teacher has, for their students. They also use diverse resources to plan and structure engaging learning opportunities. They use formative or informal assessments. They adapt their instruction as needed. So here we've got teachers being reflective practitioners, seeing what works and what doesn't, and trying it again maybe the next time to try to reach the students that they didn't reach the first time. And then they're going to evaluate learning using multiple sources of evidence. So again, just trying to adapt lessons to the different students' learning styles as to try to make the education more equitable, and so that each student, regardless of what their success or their growth would look like, they have that fair opportunity to grow and to learn based on their own individual abilities and like status at that point. Effective teachers contribute to the development of classrooms in schools that value diverse and civic mindedness. Okay, so here we've got teachers are pretty much a team. Here's our professional learning community, in a sense. Takes a village to raise a child, which we kind of get away from today most often. But effective teachers will look back into that and try to contribute and develop their classroom, even with other teachers' classrooms, so as to get the school on board to creating a place as a whole for students to come and learn and be safe and get what they need so they can get out. Effective teachers collaborate with other teachers. Here we go again with kind of what I was saying earlier there as with that previous point. They collaborate with other teachers, administrators, parents, and education professionals to ensure student success, particularly the success of students with special needs and those at risk for failure. Okay, so with a little background of some of the most often cited characteristics of teachers lumped together, I'm going to kind of look at ways to evaluate teacher effectiveness. It's no question and really no surprise that teachers do strongly impact student achievement. There have been some studies that show that teachers are actually the most significant school-based factor in impacting a student's learning or achievement. They have the most direct contact or direct relationship with these students, so that really is of no surprise. Let's see here, what is it? In determining who is a highly effective teacher or principal, states, LEAs, or schools must include multiple measures provided that effectiveness is evaluated in significant part by student growth. So that's right from the Obama administration's Race to the Top policy for evaluating teachers, or just for what they're looking at for their education reform. So we got student growth. So we're still looking at student assessments being directly linked to how an effective teacher is defined or determined. So it's not anything new. It's been in place for decades, evaluations for sure, but the fact that student learning or student achievement or student growth are linked to the effectiveness of a teacher as based on student test scores. So again, it's not going away. We're just trying to figure out how we can more objectively use those test scores, which I'll get to in just a moment. Some ways to evaluate teacher effectiveness include using classroom observations, principal observations, student feedback. Is up in Boston, I know they're doing that. Ohio, they're working on something. Portfolios, instructional or classroom artifacts. Teacher self-reports are also sometimes considered when evaluating teacher effectiveness. Background knowledge and skills, as it has definitely been related in some research studies to be directly linked also to student learning. And then student achievement itself, again, as linked to student test scores. Now, all of these have their own advantages and disadvantages when it comes to evaluating a teacher, especially evaluating a teacher's effectiveness or ineffectiveness to increase student learning. but today or for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to concentrate a little more on the value-added measure or the value-added models, since that's kind of been the latest trend in how teachers are being evaluated. So what is a value-added model? Well, Dr. William Sanders, over out in Tennessee there, he kind of put this together. He's at the University of Tennessee, concentrating more on his work in agriculture, came up with the value-added measurement, again, that he was using in his agricultural studies to create a more objective way to evaluate the impact of teachers and the school's influence on student learning. Again, it's no surprise that they are linked. So if we're going to be judged on it, then there's got to be some way to make it more objective so it'll be fair. I kind of looked more at the educational definition of value-added models as it relates, or as value-added models relate to education. It's essentially just a new way of analyzing test data that measures teaching and learning. A number of states are starting to use the value-added assessment, as I've mentioned. It's just kind of the newest trend in measuring how students are learning based on student achievement, and it's related directly to how effective or ineffective a teacher is. What it does is that it allows researchers to identify the progress made by individual students, as well as the extent to which individual teachers, schools, and districts have contributed to that progress of that individual student. Again, that's from TAP there. The value-added analysis is a statistical technique that uses student achievement data over time to measure the learning gains students make. That's one of the biggest things about it, is that they're able to kind of look at it over several years. So kind of making a little more, I don't know, significant, a little more, what I guess they would think as reliable, because you're not just looking at one classroom observation or one principal evaluation, or maybe 2 or 3 throughout the year. You're taking several years worth of data, and then you're just kind of making this map of this student. And again, it is individual students, so you're not comparing them to each other. You're not lumping them into some different category and then just kind of taking them all that way. You're looking at each one individually and just saying, okay, Johnny's math score in the 3rd grade was this. Then you measure them with the test again in the 4th grade, and then you kind of compare those two, and you take the difference, and you see what kind of growth little Johnny actually had between those. Here we've got Go defining a value-added measure as the contribution of various factors toward growth in student achievement. McCaffrey and his crew there defined as a collection of complex statistical techniques that use multiple years of students' test score data to estimate the effects of individual schools or teachers. Value-added models can show if particular students have made progress, and it can actually predict the growth or expected growth of a student. So that's another reason why they're kind of big and happening in the focus of some teacher evaluations as related to teacher effectiveness on student achievement. In the past, schools, they were just ranking or being ranked just on student achievement alone. The problem with this was that student achievement alone was affected by a lot of outside factors that were just beyond the teacher's control. You had socioeconomic status, family problems, students' background, if they were English language learners, things like that. What value-added models do to try to remedy this dilemma or kind of get around it is they, again, as I mentioned earlier, they try to focus on each individual student's progress as assessed by a test. They look at it over time. So what it does is it takes each student and makes his or her own baseline. So it tries to remove all these other confounding variables. So if one student from a low socioeconomic background made this progress or made this achievement this one year, and then you compare it to like the next year, it's just looking at just those scores and comparing them to each other. They're projected. The test scores are then projected for each year and compared to the test scores that they actually earn at the end of the year. And again, they take this difference, and that's what they kind of judge on how, if it reaches a certain number, there's some kind of cutoff there. A certain number says that the teacher was effective if they make this much progress, or it says they were ineffective if they didn't meet the expected progress. There's been a lot of push for value-added models by different research. We got Jacob and Lefgren and Milanowski. They all did studies where they did principal observations or evaluations, and they coupled that with the value-added model, and they actually showed that there was a positive correlation, that the value-added model actually was right with what the principal's evaluations had shown. In some cases, the value-added model proved to be more predictable, more reliable. And then we've got, of course, Sanders there with his research in '96 after they got the grants to look at the Knoxville, Tennessee students' data, and that's when they did their value-added model assessment. So all this has kind of supported it and try to kind of get it back into the media here of ways to evaluate teachers more fairly, more objectively. So with the push, with the need, because it has been shown that teacher quality, of course, impacts students just prominently. It's significant as far as outweighing differences in class size, socioeconomic background, race, and gender. So a need for a more objective tool to evaluate teacher effectiveness was very much needed. So some advantages of value-added models and teacher evaluations. They can provide estimates of the effects of teachers in schools not distorted by non-educational factors like family background. And again, or race, gender, socioeconomic background, that kind of thing. Another advantage is they're cost-effective and non-intrusive. They're already collecting test data just from the No Child Left Behind Act. So these kids are already taking these tests, so the data is already available. All they have to do is apply it with a value-added measurement, or look at it from a value-added model point of view. Another advantage of value-added models and teacher evaluation is that they may be useful for identifying good teachers whose classrooms can be used as learning labs, and they can also identify teachers who need extra support. So then we've got the teachers that might be struggling, so they can go and see these effective teachers, kind of see what they're doing in their classrooms, and they can also get some extra support and get some kind of, if need be, a professional learning plan, or progress plan, so that they can get back on track and increase their effectiveness. And another advantage of a value-added model and teacher evaluating is that it focuses exclusively on student learning, not teaching practices. So here it's not really so much going to say, what the teacher does, as much as it's just looking at how the student is learning. Are they progressing? Are they staying about the same? Are they exceeding their expectations? And to me, that's sort of a double-edged sword as far as an advantage or disadvantage. And I'll kind of go into that on the next slide here when we talk about the disadvantages of value-added models and teacher effectiveness, or teacher evaluations for teacher effectiveness. So, some disadvantages of value-added models for teacher evaluation. It's only as good as the quality of the student tests. So again, for the most part, student tests, what are they really testing for? Most of the time, it's like reading, math, maybe science. You're looking at how well a student takes a test and how well they can comprehend what they're reading. Maybe some subject material, depending on what it is. But essentially, it's like a student's test-taking skills. And then this is what we're linking teachers' effectiveness to, or teachers' quality. Another disadvantage of value-added models is that they're not useful for formative purposes. Again, the value-added scores alone, if you look at it as just an individual tool, it really isn't very reliable, as some studies have shown. It's better if it's coupled with teacher observations. Like the last advantage there listed on the previous slide talked about, it doesn't, like the value-added models focus on student learning and not so much teacher practices. That's kind of where it gets into, well, is it going to say how that teacher was effective or how they were ineffective? It just can't. It can't really isolate that. In low-income schools or communities, during the summer, like if they were taking the test at the beginning of the year and then they have to take it again the next beginning of the year, then there's usually a loss of retention. So the results become distorted because students have that gap right there in learning in the summer. So not really that solid in terms of that. Then another disadvantage of value-added models is that there are often other variables that affect how students are assigned to teachers. Parents have a say in where they want to put their kids, sometimes what teacher they request, if they're taking them out of school. It also matters how that student just gets put into the class, whether they, like if it's an elective, if they need it, that kind of thing, like in the higher grades. So it needs to be more randomized in order for the value-added models to be more accurate, or to at least show a little more in regards to effective or ineffective teaching. They can't tell us why a teacher is effective or ineffective. So it can tell us if they're doing well, but it can't tell us the specific ways or what the student or the teacher actually needs to work on. Then there's the missing data. Sometimes students are absent. Sometimes students move away. So if you're going to collect data over several years, if you've got some students, and not even just the students, if the test changes, so maybe it's measuring something different, or it's just a different layout and it's not like it was before, all this affects how the value-added model is used, or how it can actually purport the findings. And then there's difficulty in isolating the contributions of an individual teacher. Again, it's a school, so they are a team. They're going to be in different subject areas, different teachers are going to teach them. Again, just as it kind of boasts that it's an effective tool for eliminating such variables as student background and things of that sort, it's still dependent on the way that they use the value-added model or what they put into it. It makes it difficult to actually isolate that individual teacher's contributions alone without taking into account those other confounding variables. So, in essence, we're kind of back at square one, depending on how it's used. And again, these advantages and disadvantages are not the only ones mentioned, but I chose these to present because they were the most often reported advantages and disadvantages, depending on arguments for or against value-added models when dealing with linking student test scores to a teacher's effectiveness and then evaluating that. Some other ones that were mentioned, is that it does take several years of data. So again, if you don't have that, that kind of goes into the missing data. But that was another issue. You have to have years of data there. And then depending on how they were using it, some value-added models look more specifically at those very confounding variables. They kind of take those into consideration, the background, low-income families, that sort of thing. Some of them use that. Some of them don't. They are just looking right at teaching practices. So depending on how or the stance that the researcher uses the value-added model and what variables they're looking at, that can also affect how a value-added model tests for teacher effectiveness as related to student learning or student achievement. So to kind of wrap things up, while VAMs, the value-added models, certainly show promise because they do level the playing field, in essence, by taking out all those confounding variables, again, depending on how it's used and what the researcher is looking for, and it makes it more objective. There also are a lot of issues that still kind of need to be teased out or worked out. So, based on some of this, what do you guys think about using value-added models to assess student achievement and linking that to a teacher's effectiveness? We're all going to be teachers, and using student test scores is not going away. So, do you think this is good? Do you think this is bad? What would you suggest? How do you guys feel about it? And here's a bunch of the stuff that I used. Thanks for listening to me, guys.